At 5:47 a.m. on July 7, 1944, the jungle air on Saipan was already thick with heat, smoke, and the metallic smell of blood. Captain Benjamin Salomon was on his knees, dragging a 93-pound Browning machine gun across churned sand and broken bodies. The corpses in front of his position had piled so high they formed a wall, blocking his view of the enemy. He couldn't see them anymore, only hear them, screaming, charging, coming closer. He had been shot, more than once. He didn't know how many times. There wasn't time to count. Blood soaked through his uniform, warm and sticky, running down his side and into his boots. A bayonet wound in his shoulder burned with every movement, every breath. His hands were slick, slipping against the metal of the weapon as he tried to reposition it. And still they came. Thousands of them. Japanese soldiers pouring out of the darkness in wave after wave, the largest banzai charge of the Pacific War. Some estimates would later say 3,000, others closer to 5,000. It didn't matter. From where Salomon sat, it looked like an endless tide of men. He dragged the gun into position, slammed a fresh ammunition belt into place, and pulled the trigger. 24 hours earlier, the men in his unit had called him Doc Hollywood. Not because he was soft, not because he was weak, but because before the war, Benjamin Salomon had been a dentist in Beverly Hills, a man who cleaned teeth, not a man who killed. The nickname had started as a joke. A dentist in combat? The infantrymen had laughed when they first saw him. They expected him to wash out within days, maybe hours. They figured he'd never fired a weapon, never marched more than a mile, never known what it meant to push past exhaustion. They were wrong. On the rifle range, Salomon outshot everyone. Not just good, not lucky, consistently better than every man in the regiment. During physical training, he outperformed soldiers years younger. On long marches, he carried extra gear for men who were struggling. He didn't complain. He didn't slow down. Within months, his commanding officer called him the best all-around soldier in the unit. But the Army didn't care. They looked at his file, saw the letters DDS after his name, Doctor of Dental Surgery, and made a decision that would frustrate him for years. You're too valuable to waste in combat. So they took one of the best soldiers in the regiment and made him a dentist again. For 2 years, Benjamin Salomon filled cavities while other men went to war. For 2 years, he watched friends ship out to the Pacific, watched names disappear from rosters, watched letters come back stamped with one word, deceased. For 2 years, the man who had trained to fight was told he didn't belong. Then came Saipan. Benjamin Salomon had been born in Milwaukee, Wisconsin in 1914, the son of Jewish immigrants who had fled persecution in Eastern Europe. His parents came to America for safety, for opportunity, for a life where their children wouldn't have to live in fear. From an early age, Ben stood out. He wasn't just smart, he was driven. While other boys played games in the streets, Ben worked toward his Eagle Scout badge, mastering survival skills, first aid, and marksmanship. He learned how to shoot before most boys learned how to shave. By the time he was a teenager, he could hit targets at distances that impressed experienced marksmen. But he didn't dream of being a soldier. He wanted to be a dentist. There was something about precision that appealed to him, the careful, controlled work, the ability to fix what was broken, to take away pain. Dentistry wasn't glamorous, but it mattered. Getting there wasn't easy. In 1930s America, universities quietly limited how many Jewish students they accepted. The quotas weren't advertised, but everyone knew they existed. For a Jewish student from Milwaukee, getting into professional school meant competing not just against other applicants, but against a system designed to keep you out. Ben pushed through anyway. He studied harder than everyone else, worked jobs to pay tuition, transferred schools when he had to, and in 1937 he graduated from dental school, one of the few who made it. By 1940, he had built a successful practice in Beverly Hills. It was the kind of life people dreamed about. Good money, nice car, beautiful office, patients who hoped to become movie stars. Some of them couldn't afford treatment, so Ben treated them for free. He had everything. Then the war came. When Germany invaded Poland, Ben followed every headline, every report. He knew what was happening to Jews in Europe. He understood exactly what Nazi victory would mean.
He didn't hesitate. He tried to enlist immediately. Rejected. Too many volunteers, not enough equipment. He tried again with the Canadian Army. Rejected. Not a citizen. So he waited.
Waited while Europe burned. Waited while the war spread. Waited while the world changed. Then in 1940, his draft notice arrived. Most men felt fear when they were drafted. Ben felt relief. At last he would get his chance. Basic training proved what he already knew. He belonged there. He qualified as an expert marksman, excelled in every physical test, rose quickly through the ranks. Within a year, he was a sergeant leading a machine gun section. For the first time, everything made sense. The discipline, the coordination, the responsibility, it fit him perfectly. The machine gun wasn't just a weapon, it was a system, a precise tool that required skill, control, and absolute focus. It was, in a strange way, not so different from dentistry. Then the Army intervened. They reviewed his file again, saw his medical training, and made another decision. You're being commissioned as an officer in the Dental Corps. Salomon tried to refuse. He argued, requested reassignment. His commanding officer even supported him, writing a formal recommendation to keep him in the infantry. Denied. The Army needed dentists more than it needed machine gunners. So Benjamin Salomon was pulled from combat training and sent to Hawaii. A safe assignment, a comfortable assignment, a place where the war felt distant. Most men would have accepted it. Ben didn't. Every morning he did his job, treated patients, fixed teeth, followed orders. Every afternoon he trained with the infantry. He ran their obstacle courses, marched with them through jungle heat, fired on their ranges, studied tactics, pushed himself harder than anyone expected him to. At first, the infantry officers thought it was strange. Then they realized something. He wasn't just keeping up, he was outperforming them. He won competitions, outshot experienced riflemen, outlasted seasoned soldiers on long marches, learned faster than anyone they had seen. One officer later said, "Half my men could learn from him." The soldiers noticed too. This wasn't a man hiding behind his position. This was a man preparing for something he still believed would come. And in June 1944, it finally did. Orders came down. The 27th Infantry Division was moving out. Destination, Saipan, a small island in the Pacific, a critical target. From Saipan, American bombers could reach Japan itself. The Japanese knew it. They had fortified the island with 30,000 troops. They had no intention of surrendering. When the battalion surgeon was wounded, Salomon didn't hesitate. "I'll take over the aid station." He wasn't trained for battlefield surgery, but he was the best option available, and men were dying. So Captain Benjamin Salomon stepped into a role he had never been meant to fill, and walked straight into one of the bloodiest battles of the Pacific War. Saipan was unlike anything Benjamin Salomon had ever imagined. The island was small, but it had been turned into a fortress. Japanese forces had carved defensive positions into the terrain itself, bunkers hidden in hillsides, caves connected by tunnels, machine gun nests positioned to cover every approach. There were no clean front lines, no safe zones, just a constant grinding fight where every yard of ground had to be taken at a cost. By the time Salomon reached the front, the battle had already been raging for days. The casualties were staggering. Men came into the aid station in waves, some walking, some carried, some dragged. Many didn't make it that far. The wounded filled every available space. Stretchers lined up side by side inside the small tent. Others laid directly on the ground outside, waiting for help that might never come. Salomon worked without stopping. Triage first. Who could be saved? Who had to wait? Who was already gone? He had never trained for this. Dentists didn't learn how to stop arterial bleeding or treat massive trauma. They didn't learn how to decide which man lived and which man died based on seconds and supplies. But out here, there was no one else. So he learned. Fast. When a man came in bleeding out, Salomon didn't hesitate. He clamped wounds, improvised treatments, used whatever tools he had. His hands stayed steady even when everything around him was chaos, even when artillery shook the ground beneath his feet. The sounds never stopped. Screaming, always the screaming. Men calling for help, calling for their mothers, calling for God. Some begged for morphine, others just begged for it to stop. Salomon learned to shut it out. Not because he didn't care, because he had to. Every second spent listening was a second someone else might die. By July 6th, the situation had become desperate. American forces had pushed the Japanese into the northern end of the island. Of the original 30,000 defenders, only a fraction remained, but those who were left were not retreating. They were preparing. That night, Japanese commanders made their final decision. There would be no surrender, only one last attack. Every soldier still able to stand would join it, Army, Navy, even the wounded. They would break the American lines or die trying. Before dawn on July 7th, the men of the 105th Infantry began to sense something was coming. The jungle in front of their positions was alive with movement. They could hear it. Footsteps, whispered voices, the sound of metal against metal. Small groups of Japanese soldiers began probing the perimeter, rushing out of the darkness in short bursts, firing and screaming before disappearing again. Testing, measuring, preparing. No one slept. They all knew what it meant. At 4:45 a.m., the attack began. Flares lit up the sky, turning night into harsh white light, and out of the jungle came a wall of men. Thousands of them, charging, screaming "Tenno Heika Banzai" as they surged forward in a human wave that stretched across the horizon. The Americans opened fire immediately. Machine guns tore into the front ranks, artillery exploded among them, rifles cracked in rapid succession, tracers cut through the darkness like red lines drawn across the battlefield. It didn't slow them down. The Japanese kept coming. They climbed over bodies, ran through explosions, closed the distance no matter how many fell. Within minutes, the American line began to break. Positions were overrun. Foxholes turned into hand-to-hand combat. The controlled rhythm of organized fire dissolved into chaos. Inside the aid station, Salomon heard it all. The gunfire getting closer, the shouting, the unmistakable sound of men fighting at close range. Then the wounded started pouring in. Dozens of them, bleeding, screaming, collapsing onto the ground. The small tent filled almost instantly. Salomon moved from man to man, working as fast as he could, but there were too many. And then the enemy reached them. The tent flap burst open. A Japanese soldier rushed inside, bayonet raised, eyes fixed on a wounded American lying helpless on a stretcher. There was no time to think. Salomon grabbed a rifle and fired. The soldier dropped instantly. No pause, no hesitation. He turned back to his patients. Seconds later, 2 more enemy soldiers pushed into the tent. This time there was no space to aim. Salomon swung the rifle like a club, smashing one man to the ground, then fired at the second. One down, then another. Before he could even reset, more came. 4 of them, crawling under the tent walls, coming from both sides at once. The aid station erupted into chaos. Wounded men tried to move. Medics scrambled. The confined space turned into a deadly close-quarters fight. Salomon didn't retreat. He moved forward. He fought with whatever he had, rifle, bayonet, knife. At one point, out of ammunition, he struck a man with the rifle butt, then finished him at point-blank range when he could reload. Another attacker came in too close. Salomon met him head-on. It was fast, brutal, silent, except for the sounds of struggle. Then it was over. 8 enemy soldiers lay dead inside the tent. Salomon stood in the middle of them, breathing hard, covered in blood. Around him, 30 wounded Americans stared in disbelief. But there was no time. The battle outside was collapsing. More enemy soldiers were breaking through. The aid station would be overrun next. Salomon made a decision. Get the wounded out. The medics hesitated. It meant moving through open ground, through an active battlefield. It meant exposure, risk, almost certain casualties. Do it now. His voice left no room for argument. Men began lifting stretchers, helping the walking wounded, dragging those who couldn't move. Someone protested, "Sir, you can't." "That's an order." Salomon grabbed another rifle, fixed a bayonet. "I'll hold them off." Those were the last words anyone heard him say. He turned and ran out of the aid station, straight into the battle.
Outside, the world had collapsed into chaos. There was no clear line anymore, no organized defense, just scattered groups of American soldiers fighting desperately against a flood of Japanese troops pouring through every gap. Gunfire echoed in every direction, explosions shook the ground, men shouted, screamed, died. Salomon moved through it without hesitation. He wasn't looking for cover, he was looking for a weapon. And then he saw it. A Browning M1917 machine gun set up behind a sandbag position. 4 men had been manning it. All 4 were dead. One still slumped forward, hands locked on the ammunition belt. Salomon didn't slow down. He shoved the body aside, dropped behind the weapon, and checked the belt. Still loaded. He turned the barrel toward the advancing enemy and opened fire. The machine gun roared to life, a steady, relentless stream of bullets tearing into the charging soldiers. At this range, there was no missing. The front ranks fell instantly. Bodies collapsed into each other, momentum carrying them forward even as they died. Salomon kept firing. Reload, fire, reload, fire. The weapon grew hot in his hands. The water in the cooling jacket began to steam. The smell of burned metal mixed with blood and gunpowder. The Japanese kept coming. They charged straight at him. Some tried to flank his position. Others came head-on, bayonets fixed, screaming as they closed the distance. He cut them down, every burst controlled, every movement deliberate. He had trained for this. Long before the army had taken him out of combat training, before they had told him he didn't belong here, he had mastered this exact weapon. Now, finally, he was using it. A grenade exploded nearby. Shrapnel tore into his body. He felt it, felt the impact, felt the pain, but he didn't stop. Another bullet hit him, then another, each one taking more strength, more blood. But every second he stayed on that gun meant more time for the wounded to escape, so he stayed. The bodies began to pile up in front of him, 1 layer, then 2, then 3. Soon they were stacked so high he couldn't see over them anymore. His field of fire was gone, a wall of dead blocking the living. Most men would have stopped, would have stayed where they were, would have accepted that they had done enough. Salomon didn't. He let go of the gun, forced himself to stand, and dragged it. 93 pounds of steel, through sand soaked with blood, through bodies, through pain that should have stopped him. He pulled it to a new position, set it down, loaded another belt, and opened fire again. They kept coming, and he kept killing, again and again and again. Each time the bodies piled too high, he moved the gun. 4 times. 4 times he repositioned that weapon, each move harder than the last. By the final move, he could barely stand. Blood loss had drained him. His strength was gone, but he kept going. He dragged the gun one last time, leaving a visible trail of blood behind him in the sand. Set it, loaded it, and fired, until there was nothing left. No more ammunition, no more strength, no more life. The battle lasted hours. By the time it ended, the cost was staggering. The American battalions had been nearly destroyed, hundreds dead, hundreds more wounded. But the Japanese force had been annihilated, thousands killed. The largest banzai charge of the war had failed. The next day, American troops returned to the position. What they found was something none of them would forget. Salomon was still at the machine gun, slumped over it, where he had fallen. In front of him lay a field of bodies. 98 Japanese soldiers counted within range of his position. 98. 1 man, 1 machine gun. When they examined his body, the full reality became clear. 76 bullet wounds, more than 20 bayonet wounds, many of them inflicted while he was still alive. He had been shot, stabbed, torn apart, and he had kept fighting, long enough to hold the line,
long enough for the wounded to escape, long enough to make a difference. The soldiers who survived never forgot what he had done, but the system almost did. When his actions were first reviewed, the Medal of Honor recommendation was denied. The reason? He had been wearing a Red Cross armband, a medical officer, technically not supposed to engage in combat. The reality didn't matter. That he had defended wounded men, that he had no choice, that without him dozens more would have died. None of it mattered to the paperwork. The recommendation was rejected. Years passed, then decades. Attempts were made to correct it. Each one failed, until finally, nearly 60 years later, the decision was reversed. In 2002, President George W. Bush awarded the Medal of Honor to Captain Benjamin Salomon. There was no family left to receive it. No parents, no siblings, no wife, no children. Only history and the record of what one man had done. Benjamin Salomon had been a dentist, a man trained to save lives, and in the end, that's exactly what he did. Not with tools, not with medicine, but with a machine gun, holding the line alone against an army until his last breath.